Hello and welcome to the revision video for Unit 1.3. This is going to be about the economic and social issues experienced in the crisis years in Weimar Germany. We're going to be looking at things like the post-war legacy and the state of the German economy and society, thinking about the impact of reparations, inflation, hyperinflation, and the invasion of the Ruhr as well. Okay, let's make a start. The first area we need to know about is economic problems that weren't down to the Weimar government. So we're thinking about the government policy before 1919, essentially what had the Kaiser been doing. Now, first of all, Germany had caused lots of problems for itself through high levels of borrowing, especially for the First World War. Now, even before the First World War begins, already the Germans put themselves under financial pressure because of the Kaiser's obsession with the navy and Weltpolitik. He'd created a series of 5 different naval laws that had caused enormous amounts of spending before the war even begins. Now, during the war, 84% of what they spent was borrowed, and only 16% of their expenditure was raised through taxes. Now, they'd done this because they'd had this flawed calculation that they would win the war. They had something called the Schlieffen Plan that they created that made them think that they would win the war within a couple of months. They would defeat France within about 6 weeks, and then they'd be able to turn their attention on Russia and defeat them quite quickly as well. So they truly believed they'd be able to recoup their losses and charge reparations when they won the war. This was a highly risky strategy, and obviously it didn't pay off for them in reality. Therefore, in 1919, the new government of the Weimar Republic was faced with an enormous debt even before reparations then added. They've already got a debt of 1.44 billion marks. Now, they were in a difficult position, a very precarious position, because they didn't want to increase taxes, because that would be a highly unpopular move, and they felt that they couldn't afford to lose any support. So they had prioritised political stability over economic stability. And we can understand why they did this, but it wasn't a wise decision. However, some historians have said that we shouldn't be too critical of the state of the German economy in 1919, because in some ways they coped with the transition to peacetime better than other countries. For instance, in terms of the unemployment, it had virtually disappeared by 1921. And in some ways, they've done better than other countries like Britain. So there is some criticism of the way that the Kaiser's governments handled their economy, but it's essentially not only down to the previous people. We also have to understand that the government made some decisions not to try and counteract these problems, and they put their political stability over economic stability, as we'll see in more detail in a second. We've just looked at the problems that were left by the old Kaiser's government. Now let's think about the problems caused by the Weimar government and their policies. We've already heard about these briefly, but we're going to go through them in a little bit more depth now. Now, essentially, the Weimar government didn't want to try and deal with their problems effectively, because to deal with that problem of high debt, they would have had to put in place really unpopular measures, for instance, raising taxes or reducing government spending. Now, at a time when there was already great hatred of the government for signing the armistice and then by June 1919 signing the Treaty of Versailles, they had decided that this could push Germany over the edge into a potential revolution. So they decided at this point to prioritise political stability rather than long-term economic recovery. Now, at first, they were able to get away with the problems because they ignored them and they essentially swept them under the rug, and it was okay for a little while. For instance, we've just heard that actually, in comparison to some other nations, the German economy was doing all right in the short term. For instance, with unemployment that we just mentioned had virtually disappeared in Germany, it was only 1.8% in 1921, and compared with Britain that was facing unemployment of 17%, we can see that Germany was doing quite well. We're also managing because inflation at this point was benefiting some of their supporters to some extent, and there were some positive consequences for the government, which is why they allowed inflation to continue. Now, obviously, inflation becomes hyperinflation in the summer of 1923 as a result of a load of different factors, but the short-term trigger was the French and Belgian invasion of the Ruhr that happens in January 1923. but inflation had been a problem for a long time. Now, the prices, because of the amount that the German government had borrowed and how the currency had devalued, prices actually doubled between 1918 and 1919. And by 1920, prices were 14 times higher than they had been in 1913. Now, just so you're aware, wages hadn't increased in line with prices, so this was having a significant detrimental impact on German workers who weren't able to buy as many goods as they were before. Now, some people have been very critical of the German government and the fact that they essentially ignored their problems at this point, but they did so because it benefited them to a certain extent. And you need to know about a few reasons why they allowed inflation to continue. And ultimately, it all comes down to this point again about political stability was prioritised over economic stability. Okay, so let's look at why it helped them then. So first of all, at this point, the Centre Party were a very crucial group in the German governments. Remember, there wasn't a single government in Germany that wasn't a coalition, and each coalition had at least 3 different political parties in it. The Centre Party were always crucial to this, and they were important in leading lots of coalitions. Now, inflation actually benefited their supporters because a lot of their supporters were rich businessmen and industrialists. Now, they benefited from inflation because what they used to do is borrow lots in short-term loans, and then when they paid those loans back, the real value of those loans had significantly declined. So essentially, they were benefiting financially from inflation because the real value of the money they paid back is not as much as what they borrowed. There's an example here of Hugo Steins, who was somebody that was known as the King of the Ruhr, who benefited from this policy. Obviously, he's doing this on a large scale because he owns over 1,500 companies. But it's certainly true that lots of Centre Party supporters benefited on a smaller scale from this policy of inflation. It also helped the government because it lessened government debt. We know that the Kaiser, as a result of his policies of expanding his navy and also the cost of the First World War, had already got Germany in a debt of 1.44 billion marks. Now, this helps to reduce government debt because, again, the amount of money that they're actually paying back in real terms has lessened. Remember, this doesn't help with reparations though, because reparations aren't paid in the German marks. They are paid in the form of gold, manufactured goods, and raw materials like coal. So it helps lessen their debt, but not reparations. So essentially, this allowing inflation to continue is good for the Weimar government in the short term. It helps them politically because it means that they're not putting in place unpopular measures, but it also helps them because it encourages investment and also supports Germany's case that reparations should be abolished, reduced or rescheduled because their economy can't deal with it. However, even though it's good for them in the short term, obviously we know about the long-term consequences. We know it leads to hyperinflation, which causes a complete collapse in the German currency, and is going to have long-term political consequences as well, because it puts in place this idea that the German government can't deal with big economic problems, and obviously that will become more important after the Great Depression hits in October 1929. So overall, the next area of the economy that you need to know is about the unwise policy of the Weimar governments, but you also need to understand why it is that they put those policies in place. Linked to what we've just been discussing is government policy and the cost of social welfare. Now, this was something that exacerbated an already existing issue of the German government being in significant debt. Now, the cost of social provision in Germany was really high. By the late 1920s, the German government spent 26% of their gross national product on social expenditure, compared to 15% that they used to spend in 1913. Now, the reason why they're spending so much money is because the German government had promised a lot during the revolution. They had promised that under this new democratic system, things were going to be very different and they were going to put the rights of the people at the heart of the constitution. They'd also said in their constitution at the start, in the Bill of Rights that every German citizen should have the right to work or welfare. So they therefore had to try and make sure that they actually stuck to those terms of the Constitution and introduced a lot of things to help the German population. Now, they made loads of different reforms in Weimar Germany, things like even the maximum working day being 8 hours, but other reforms they introduced as well that had a financial impact on them are things like the state health insurance system. Now, essentially, this hadn't really existed before the 1890s, and the Kaiser had reluctantly passed some social welfare reforms after pressure from the SPD, because at that point 1 in 3 people were voting for them. But they're essentially extending the system that had been put in place before. They're doing this to allow extra payments for wives, daughters, and the disabled. So essentially, they're extending their health insurance. Furthermore, in 1919, the government also introduced aid for war veterans who couldn't work, and they now became the responsibility of the national government. Not only that, but there is aid for war widows and orphans. And remember, there are a lot of people that have been affected by the First World War. There are over 600,000 war widows as a result of World War I, because remember that 2 million German soldiers had died. Now, there's also a lot of orphans, over 900,000 orphans as a result of the First World War as well. So the German government has now promised that they're going to look after all these different people. This means that there's a huge demand placed on the government, and they had to print more money to go on paying these benefits because they didn't have the existing finances to be able to pay them. Remember, they've got to pay this on top of things like their existing debt and the reparation payments. So essentially, social welfare exacerbated the crisis. It made the value of the mark fall even further because they've been printing more money, and therefore it made the situation of inflation worse. So this is one of the factors that contributes to hyperinflation that happens by the summer of 1923. It's worth being aware of this and the previous slide, because there are some exam questions that could come up that could ask you about whose fault was hyperinflation. Was it the result of government policy, or was it the result of allied foreign invaders like the French and Belgian troops who invade the Ruhr in 1923? So definitely make sure that you pause it here and that you know about government policy and the result of the actions of both the Kaiser's government but also the Weimar Republic as well. The next area that we need to know about is about reparations and their impact. Now, first of all, I want you to remember that reparations weren't decided until 1921, even though the peace treaty had been signed on the 28th of June 1919. Now, when they had signed the peace treaty, reparations were a real issue of contention. First of all, because they were linked to the hated Clause 231, the war guilt clause that said Germany was solely responsible for the war and therefore they should pay for the damage that was caused by it. It caused an issue because it was linked to that, but also because Germany was having to sign the peace treaty when they didn't know how much reparations were going to be set at. There was lots of criticism that Germany was signing a blank cheque and this would come back to haunt them in the future. Now, in 1921, the Reparations Commission determined the scale of the damage that had been done to France and Belgium in particular, and they decided that the total amount of reparations that Germany would have to pay would be £6.6 billion worth, or 132 billion gold marks. Now remember, this isn't actually paid in currency, it's paid in lots of different forms that the Allies have decided they want. It's paid in the form of gold, some of it is paid in the form of raw materials and things like coal, and some of it is paid for in manufactured goods. The reason why they don't let Germany pay it in their own currency is because then the government could have just printed more money and paid their reparations off easily with a devalued German currency. And they're very wary of this, and therefore they say it's got to be paid in those forms that we just talked about. Now, knowing what the reparations were is important, but even more important is to know their political and economic impact. So first of all, let's think about the political impact. Now, the German government was given another ultimatum to sign in 1921 with the amount of reparations, just like they had been with the original treaty back in June 1919. Now, going back to June 1919, remember that Scheideman's government actually collapsed over the Treaty of Versailles. They refused to sign it, and a new government had to be brought in that signed it, even though they didn't want to, because they knew that they had no choice. The same happens again in 1921. Again, another massive political crisis here. A new chancellor has to be brought in, and he unwillingly signs it because he knows he's got no hope. They're hoping, these politicians, that they'll be able to put in place a policy of fulfilment where they'll agree to the Allies' terms at first, but they hope over time the Allies will start to come round, especially when they're less angry as time has gone on, and they're hoping eventually the Allies will see that it's beyond Germany's capacity to pay. Now, in 1921, they managed to scrape together enough money and enough resources to be able to pay off their first payments. But in 1922, they realise they're going to have to postpone their payments because they can't afford it. They ask in November for a loan of 500 million marks and to be released from their reparations obligations for 3 to 4 years. Now, this really upsets countries like France and Belgium, who feel that Germany is responsible for the First World War and that they need to help them pay for the rebuilding of their nations. So there's a lot of anger, and remember that Germany is very politically isolated at this point. They are seen as this defeated nation that is responsible for the deaths of millions of people, and they've not been forgiven for this at this point. So we need to know about the political impact, but we also need to know about the economic impact. Now, this adds to an existing economic burden and makes the situation so much worse. We already know that Germany had to pay 1.44 billion marks from what they'd spent on their own war expenditure. Not only that, but they also have to try and pay for all of the social welfare that they promised people. They've got to pay their own war veterans and their own war widows for what had gone on in the First World War. And they're already struggling with problems like inflation, because remember that prices are 14 times higher in 1920 than they were in 1913. So reparations make the repayment of their other debts even worse. But reparations are also really difficult for Germany for a number of reasons that we've got listed on this PowerPoint. First of all, Germany had to pay their reparations in different forms. Remember that they were paying these to both France and Belgium because they were two countries that were really badly affected by the First World War. One form that they've got to pay in is gold, but their gold reserves were inadequate for the amount they were being asked for. They also had to pay in the form of coal, but the Allies had made it really difficult for them to pay in coal because the Saar coal fields, which were part of Germany, had been taken away in the Treaty of Versailles for 15 years, and they'd been put under the control of the League of Nations, and all the coal from that area had been given to France. So they've got to pay in coal, but their main way of producing coal has been taken away from them, so it's really difficult for them to meet the demands. To make a situation even worse, the Allies have hampered their potential to pay by doing things like not really trading with Germany. After the First World War, there is a decline in international trade in comparison to the pre-war situation. And countries that are not really trading as much certainly don't want to trade with Germany, who they see as the kind of enemy and this defeated nation that have caused this destruction all across Europe and elsewhere. The Allies, as part of the reparation payments, also confiscate a lot of their merchant fleet. So that makes it more difficult for the Germans to be able to kind of economically recover after the First World War. There's also, to protect their own economies, lots of high tariffs imposed on German goods. Essentially, this is a tax that is placed on top of the German goods that makes it more expensive to buy a German good than buying one from your own country. It's all put in place to try and encourage people to buy from their own countries and local businesses. And it works, but it does obviously have a negative impact on Germany. So hence Germany's in a difficult financial position, and it's worsened by reparations, and therefore they print more money. So that's what we need to know about the political and economic impact of reparations. We've just thought about the political and economic impact of reparations, but I just want to go through a few extra points of things that you need to know about it. First of all, we want to think about opinions on reparations and whether they were fair. Now, reparations arguably caused the crisis of hyperinflation in 1923. They weren't the sole reason, but they certainly contributed to a worsening economic situation. So let's think about different historians and different economists and whether they think the reparations were actually fair or not. Now, the first person to know about is Keynes. Keynes was a British economist that was very famous at the time. He actually went to the Paris Peace Conference to work as an advisor to the British government because he was an economic expert. And he was so mad during the discussions of reparations that he actually walked out of the conference, refused to have anything to do with the Treaty of Versailles, and even wrote a book in 1919 called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, where he said this was going to damage the economies of all of Europe and all of the Allies. So Keynes had a real issue with the amount of reparations they were charging. He said, based on the German economy, that £2 billion was the safe maximum figure. So we've got here one economist who is very critical of the amount of reparations that Germany had to pay. However, other historians and other economists have been more supportive of the Allies and the amount of reparations that they charged. For instance, Peucer says that reparations were actually manageable. He says that it was manageable because it only amounted to 2% of their gross national product. Their gross national product is the total amount of money that Germany would make in a year from their goods and services. So he says it was actually not beyond their capacity to pay, and actually they just didn't pay reparations because it suited their foreign policy objectives. It was good for the German government to claim that they couldn't afford it, so that eventually reparations would have been reduced. So two very different ideas there, and I want you to think about your own opinion of reparations. Do you think they were too high, and to what extent do you think they caused Germany's economic problems? Now, to some extent, it did lead to hyperinflation because the German government's response when they are dealing with lots of different issues is often just to print more money. Reparations, even though they weren't paid in German marks, put more financial pressure on the government and arguably led to them printing more money to pay off their other existing debts and the cost of social welfare. But it's not solely responsible for the problem of hyperinflation. We need to remember that this was a complex result of lots of different aspects of economic policy, and it wasn't down solely to the Allies, even though the Allies certainly made the German economic position much worse by putting increased pressure on them and also making it even more difficult to pay by, for instance, hampering their export trade and taking away lots of their merchant ships. So make sure you've got your own opinion on reparations sorted before you move on. Next economic problem we're going to look at over the next couple of slides is about the invasion of the Ruhr and the government response. Now, this was the trigger for hyperinflation, so it's really important we know the details of this. So let's first of all think about the background and the events of the invasion of the Ruhr. Now, as we know, by the end of 1922, Germany had fallen seriously behind with its reparations to France, especially in the form of coal. This prompted the French and Belgian troops to invade in order to extract reparations by force. In January 1923, 60,000 men invaded the Ruhr industrial area, which was the industrial heartland of Germany. That force then grew to about 100,000 troops by the end of 1923. The reason for the invasion, which was totally legal according to the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, was to try and force the Germans to comply with the terms and make sure they could extract those reparations by force. They wanted to take all of the area's coal, steel and manufactured goods as a form of reparations, and therefore they occupied this important industrial area as they felt this was the best place to go in order to get what they wanted. They took control of all of the mines, factories, steelworks and railways, and they even demanded food from the shops and set up things like machine gun posts in the streets. So the impact of this was enormous. It shows that they are acting really aggressively, and they've also forced the government into paying the striking workers, because the German government had no choice really in that moment. They couldn't defend themselves militarily because their army has been reduced to 100,000 men, which is very pitiful in comparison to the size of the French army. And they also can't go and ask, for instance, the League of Nations for help, because this is totally illegal according to the Treaty of Versailles. So make sure you know about these events and the background to the hyperinflation crisis. The German government is really wary of seeming like they're cooperating with the French. We've just discussed that they can't put in place any kind of military action, but they also can't be seen to be doing nothing and letting the Allies do this. Now already these people have been accused of betraying the fatherland and stabbing the army in the back. They can't get away with just letting the Allies take these goods and be seen as these weak politicians that are doing nothing. So they do the only thing that they can think of, and that is ordering this policy of passive resistance. They essentially ask all of the workers in that area to go on strike. There are also some German paramilitary groups that unofficially do things like carrying out acts of sabotage, blowing up the railways, which tries to stop French troops getting to this area of the Ruhr, but also it stops the trains with German goods being transported back to France and Belgium. The German workers, as we can see here, are promised by the government that their wages will continue if they go on strike. The German government doesn't have access to that money, so they end up printing more, and this is why this is the final thing before hyperinflation starts. It's the trigger, the final blow to the faltering mark, which has been devaluing over time. So the economic impact of the invasion of the Ruhr is massive. It also has a political impact as well, which we'll come back to in a bit, but economically, absolutely crushing to the German economy. First of all, paying the striking workers cost them twice the amount that reparations would have cost. So in terms of an economic policy, it wasn't very sensible, but lots of historians argue that it was politically necessary because the German people already saw their government as weak. If they stood back and did nothing, there could have been some kind of revolution, or there could have been some kind of wide-scale rebellion. So in some ways it was necessary, but it did cost twice the amount of reparations. Also, the output in the Ruhr as a result of the strike fell to a fifth of its pre-occupational output. So this is an area that makes a lot of money for the German government, and now they're basically not producing anything anymore. So it has an enormous impact because the government therefore is not getting any tax revenue from the businesses, and at the same time it's having to pay the workers on top of that. They even have to do things like importing coal and paying higher prices for it because they don't have enough as a result of the strikes. The shortages of goods as well, because they're not producing anything, pushes prices up even further. Remember that by 1920 prices were 14 times higher than 1913. Now imagine how bad that's got from January 1923 when there isn't any more goods being produced. And it also has a massive impact because it angers the French. It isn't just about the economic impact on Germany, it's also about the impact on international relations. The French are already seething that they've had to invade Germany to try and get their reparations, which they believe they're owed. But now they see Germans standing in the way of reparations, which the French thought were totally fair. This results in the French angrily expelling 150,000 people from this region and killing 132 people, including a 7-year-old boy, during some armed clashes. Now that itself then has a further political impact on the German government because they are seen as being weak in not dealing with this French force with their military. They're seen as being people that are standing by whilst German people are being murdered. And some people say that those people were only murdered as a result of the German government's policy. So they can't really win here. They're being blamed for their lack of action and they're being blamed for their policy of passive resistance. So they're in a really bad situation, essentially. Now, this does then cause hyperinflation because the government still wouldn't raise taxes, so they end up printing more money to pay these striking workers, and this is the final blow to the currency. It triggers hyperinflation. So to some extent, we need to be aware that the government did cause hyperinflation. However, you could also argue that hyperinflation is the result of the foreign governments, the allies, who did things like invading the Ruhr, which triggered it. I've got a quote here from a historian as well, suggesting that the inflation of 1923 had little to do with the reparations payment and actually how the German government chose to use the printing press and their extravagant use of it. So this historian, Philip Bell, is essentially arguing that actually the reparations weren't the cause, it was the German government's response to it. I want you to think about your own opinion on this. Would you say that the hyperinflation crisis was caused by the German government, or would you suggest that it was caused by the Allies and things like the invasion of the Ruhr? I just asked you to think of this question in the last slide, but again, just in case you didn't already, make sure that you've got your own opinion decided on whether Germany's economic problems were a result more of their policies or as a result of the policies of the Allied governments. So just make sure you think about that. And then here I've just put a quick diagram for you to show you why did the invasion of the Ruhr lead to hyperinflation, and it's just got step by step why it caused and why it triggered the hyperinflation crisis. The next area that we need to know about is hyperinflation itself. And we've already talked about how inflation had been a problem for a long time. However, during the hyperinflation crisis, money lost its meaning as prices soared to unimaginable levels. This is because the monetary system is built on confidence, and there was a lot less confidence in the system and what it was actually worth. And by 1923, the situation is so bad that it cost them more to print a banknote than it was actually worth. They had 2,000 printing firms printing money round the clock to keep up with the demand. At first, they have to start introducing 100 mark notes, then it's 1,000 mark notes, then it is things like a million mark notes, billion. They even get up to trillion mark notes that they are printing to try and keep up with the demand. Now, we know all the stories from GCSE already about people collecting their wages in wheelbarrows, people trying to spend their money immediately on payday before prices rose again. There's even stories of people going to a restaurant and by the time they finish their meal, the price of their main has gone up even more. So this kind of thing happened with extraordinary speed. The price of a loaf of bread by the summer of 1923 increased to 200 billion marks. This meant that not only did people have no confidence in their currency, but they actually resorted to a more medieval form of exchange rather than using money. So there was often people bartering their possessions in exchange for supplies rather than using money. Farmers also started to hoard supplies at this point because they saw little worth in selling their food, which was more necessary than other goods, for money. So we get real issues in Weimar Germany of food riots, food being stolen from farms, and just a general breakdown in law and order. So this economic problem had massive social implications and social consequences. It also has enormous political consequences because people blamed the government for these economic problems that they said were avoidable and actually caused by the German government's policies. So that's what we need to know about for the cause of the hyperinflation crisis and the impact on certain people. In a second, we're going to look at a little bit more of a detailed breakdown of who were the winners and losers of hyperinflation. So we're now going to think about the winners and losers of hyperinflation. The majority of people lost out as a result of it, but let's just briefly pause and think about the winners. So there were some people who managed to speculate quite successfully, and they managed to manipulate the situation to their advantage. And we've got a list of those people on the left-hand side here. So for instance, there were some people who were black marketeers, who bought food and sold it for vastly inflated prices. There were lots of food shortages, and this meant that lots of people were willing to pay a higher price for it. So there were some people that took advantage of that situation. There was also a lot of people with debt. Now, if you already had high debt, for instance, you had a substantial mortgage, now with the currency devaluing, it meant that you could pay off your loans easily because all of a sudden, your mortgage might be the same price as a loaf of bread. So obviously, groups like the banks lose out as a result of that, but it was good for some people who had borrowed vast amounts when they couldn't afford it. It was also good for some business people. We mentioned already that the Centre Party, lots of their supporters had benefited from inflation because they used to take out short-term loans and pay them back later once the value of the currency had devalued further. Some people as well had entered into long-term contracts when it came to things like their rents, and therefore the amount of money that they're actually spending on it might have increased, but the real value of it has declined. There's also people like the farmers, where they didn't lose out as much because money was less important in the rural communities and they were able to have enough food and not have to experience the same sort of riots for food that people had experienced in the cities. However, remember, the majority of people lose out as a result of hyperinflation, especially those people that relied on savings, investments, or a fixed income. So, for instance, pensioners and war widows had been living on state pensions, but they didn't increase to the same scale that the currency devalued. So they were really struggling with actually being able to live and be able to afford even the basic necessities. People who had also lent money to the government in the form of war bonds lost out because their interest payments decreased in value. The landlords lost out if they had fixed rent contracts. They couldn't break those contracts, but now obviously they're not getting very much money. So essentially, in some cases, they are not receiving any income from their properties. Also, those people that are unskilled workers or those not in trade unions weren't able to get their wages to increase in line with inflation. So by the end of this crisis, there are essentially a lot of people that have dealt with an extreme decline in their living standards because their wages are not increasing in line with prices. Small business owners also can't keep up with inflation. And obviously there are people as well that are relying on social welfare, people that are already ill, for instance, and this results in lots of people feeling the pressure and suffering when it comes to their mental health. Things like the rate of suicide increases as well. Now, the last point at the bottom is something to bear in mind, that the effects of hyperinflation varied between different classes and geographic regions. The middle classes, the Mittelstand as they're sometimes known as, were particularly hard hit and many became uncertain about the future. Their savings were wiped out and they weren't replaced. But generally, the impact of hyperinflation differed on different people. Some groups won, some groups lost, but all people were affected psychologically by hyperinflation, even if they benefited. So let's think about some historians and what they say about hyperinflation. Fulbrook talks about how hyperinflation confirmed a deep-seated dislike of democracy as the savings plans, hopes and assumptions of a generation were swept away. Puker agrees with her and says about how hyperinflation had enormous psychological implications. So even those people that benefited from it still had a lack of trust in the government, as they knew this was still a terrible economic situation for the majority of people. So there's lots of historians that argue that hyperinflation played a small role, at least, in the downfall of the Weimar Republic in 1933. It's not until the Great Depression that groups like the Nazis are able to increase their support. But some people argue that if they hadn't dealt with this major economic problem in 1923, people might have had more faith in the government when it comes to the major economic problem of the Great Depression from 1929. So it certainly did play a role in the downfall of the Weimar Republic, and we can't say that this didn't have long-term political consequences. So that's what you need to know about for hyperinflation. As always, I want you to make sure that you're now doing something using this revision PowerPoint and the notes in your exercise books. So make a Cornell grid, do some mind maps, or even do a red pen, black pen activity. The final thing to do is, once you've revised the knowledge and you feel confident with it, you could then have a go at planning an exam question or two. Now there's loads of different ones in your packs, but this is a great one to plan if you haven't already. This comes from an old exam which says government policy in the years 1919 to 1923 was responsible for hyperinflation in 1923. That's a great question because it will rely on you using all of your knowledge from the whole of this unit 1.3. So have a go at that. You could write out the whole exam answer or just plan it, and then you can give it to me to mark.